So in this third lecture, we're looking at the history of constitutions from 1925, after the publishing of the Code of Canon Law and the updating of the constitutions. Then what happened? Then we went through a period of perhaps 60 years or so of interim updates when changes in the law, changes in the what was expected of particular monasteries were introduced somehow or other into the constitutions. So mostly the constitutions were kept current by pasting inserts over the outdated text. So the General Chapter would publish a new version of a particular constitution, and that would be printed out, and abbots would go home and with nothing else to do would cut it out and stick it into the existing text of the constitutions. It was not an ideal situation, obviously, and you ended up with, after every chapter with bits and pieces of paper stuck all over the text of the constitutions, and that's presuming that the abbots were zealous enough to do their cutting and pasting. So these new changes came either from the General Chapter or from changes in universal law. Then in 1977, which is about 50 years after, a new text was printed, incorporating all the changes that had been made between 1971 and 1977. So you had a new text. You didn't have to stick things in anymore. And although the General Chapter of 1967 had started the process of writing new constitutions, the capitulants were advised in 1969 by a former novice of Scourmont, Jean Bayet, Jesuit, not to hurry. He said, "Oh, take your time. Rome wasn't built in a day." And so that's exactly what they did. They were in no hurry to produce constitutions. So remember, council ended about 1965, and already there are rumblings, documents from Rome telling people to get new constitutions, telling people to start organizing themselves. The big advances that were made at the 1969 chapter were the Declaration on Cistercian Life, which gave some sort of identity to the order, its history, its character, and so forth, and the Statute on Unity and Pluralism, which gave the essential observances of the order, what could be modified and what could be kept, unity and pluralism. And once these were published with a great deal of consensus among the chapters participants, then the urgency about producing constitutions was greatly reduced. But as often happens, one chapter decides and the next chapter decides the opposite. The chapter of 1971 wanted the work to begin without delay and charged the Law Commission with its completion. So the Law Commission was given the job of writing constitutions. But let's go back to the 69 General Chapter. According to the decisions of the General Chapter and the permissions received from the Holy Sees, the 1925 constitutions continued to be manually altered until in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, the General Chapter of 1969 made provision for a new Latin edition, which showed first where experiments against the letter of the law were permitted or contrary custom existed. So this is the law, but you can avoid this in certain circumstances. Some of the participants were aware that the world was round, that the seasons are not the same all over the world, that what is summer in the northern hemisphere is winter in the southern hemisphere, and things like that. They had to show where laws had ceased to have any relevance or to have only directive force. So this was a way, a perennial way that the General Chapter deals with dissent, is by saying it's reserved to the judgment of the local abbot. And all the abbots are in agreement with that. So you don't have to reach any consent. And then they put in something that has only directive force. And if you have somebody that wants to insist on it in their own monastery, they can do so. And this latter applied especially in the parts dealing with monastic observances. And thirdly, it had to show where laws simply reflected universal church law and did not result from any decision of the General Chapter. So it was a kind of working text to help people to start thinking about the new constitutions, even if no provision was made until the following General Chapter. So there were temporary versions. A new and by its own admission highly ephemeral updating appeared in 1972, which was following the mandate of the previous year's General Chapter. The text was written in French and translated into the other languages without a Latin version. Its aim was to facilitate consultation and to eliminate whatever was no longer applicable. So it's not new constitutions at all. It's just trying to sort out what we need to keep of the existing constitutions and what can be left aside. At this point, there was no question of a radical revision either of the juridical content of the constitutions or of the form in which it was cast. And then, if that's not enough, in 1974, an addenda corrigenda to this was issued. So changing bits and pieces all along. The process of revision was continued with a new edition in 1977, which incorporated all the relevant changes due to universal or proper law since the Vatican Council. And we're going to leave it at that point for the moment. And just to backtrack, to say a little bit about the regulations. Now, the usages or regulations were revised in 1926 to accord with the new constitutions. And these also had become very out of date. And so a long overdue revision was ordered by the General Chapter of 1958, and a provisional edition circulated in January 1964, only in duplicated form. It was never printed. It was circulated in duplicated form, aiming to serve as a means of sanctification and also as a means of securing good order and peace in the monastery. It tried to have little spiritual texts every so often. It was very much the brainchild of Don Gabriel Sorte. It had little spiritual texts and so forth, but it as with most compositions, it tended to add. When texts are revised, they tend always to get longer. And so it was much more detailed in some ways, and it never really took off, as I remember. I was slightly involved because it was sent out to the abbots in French, and my abbot didn't understand French, and I had to interpret it for him and to listen to his not always complimentary comments on the topic. The General Chapter of 1958 approved, this is beyond the regulation, this is now the Ratio Studiorum, the thing of studies. After Sede Sapientiae of Pius XII, they decided they have to have a Ratio Studiorum. General Chapter of 1958 approved an idealistic but impractical Ratio Studiorum, which attempted to put into effect the Apostolic Constitution Sede Sapientiae of the 31st of May 1956. Among the courses recommended were archaeology. It just simply copied sections out of other things. The Formation Commission issued a report on the situation in November 1968, and the General Chapter of the following year requested that communities make it the object of serious study. In other words, the abbots didn't want to, so they hoped the communities would do it. And this scrutiny continued until the General Chapter of 1990 issued its guidelines on formation to replace the largely ignored ratio. It was well-intentioned, I suppose, is the best you could say about it, trying to upgrade the quality of study in the order. And the other thing that happened was, of course, the building of Monte Cistello and the sending of lots and lots and lots of people to Rome to study. And thereupon, some returned to their monasteries, many did not, or at least they didn't stay. And in a survey that was done in, I think, the 1970s, it was noted that only 3 people in the order were actually studying, unless they had to teach, unless they were formators or had to teach something. People were not actually studying as a noble art themselves. And all this, of course, is mainly about the monks. There's very little about the nuns until their first General Chapter. Meanwhile, the ritual continued to develop. The Rituale was approved in 1688 and printed the following year, with revisions in 1822 and 1913. A temporary updating was circulated in 1982. A more definitive updating for both Cistercian orders was published in 1998. But no substantial revisioning of monastic rites has taken place. Merely a series of minor adjustments, heavily obsequious to the Roman ritual. And the Cistercian rite, meanwhile, had been downgraded to the Cistercian usage of the Roman rite. So now we're back with the constitutions, and the question is, why did it take so long? Well, the order had already begun to change in the 1950s. I think we need to recognise this, that in many ways we were ahead of the game, particularly with regard to the liturgy, and that meant dropping the daily recitation of the Little Office of the Blessed Virgin, reducing the number of times that the Office of the Dead was recited, and other changes. The decision to build Monte Cistello led to changes in intellectual horizons and personal attitudes that took many years to be integrated within the order. So the rustic image that had been so cherished in the 1950s began to be somewhat modified. Not always, not everywhere, but somewhat modified. From 1945 to 1965, there are a lot of foundations. There were 23 foundations. So in 20 years, 23 foundations. Of these, 17 came from English-speaking houses, which means that the proportion of French-speaking houses was being reduced. In the early 60s, I remember when my abbot was going to the General Chapter, everything was in French. he had to rely on a neighbour for a few whispered summaries of what was taking place. He didn't have a clue, and there was not much attention paid to those who didn't speak French. They were scarcely real Cistercians anyhow, except when it came to money questions. They were a bit more flexible there. So 17 out of 23 foundations were English-speaking, and which means that the complexion of the order, the cultural complexion of the order, was thus being changed. And even though many of these new foundations weren't particularly vocal in the general chapters, as you can see from reading the minutes, although they weren't vocal, they still had fingers. They still voted, and their particular priorities, pastoral priorities, were often more reflected in the decisions and in the discussion in the commissions than in the lengthy monologues brought forth by a few members of the chapter who somewhat monopolised the speaking roles. A practical consequence of this process of internationalisation was a certain concentration on reforming the order's structures of governance. Partly this was in response to the way that Dom Gabriel Sorte ran the order. He was a military background and had a very militaristic way of administering the order. He didn't speak any other languages. His perspective was French Trappist, and this is what he felt he was obligated to insist on wherever he went. And so there was underground emerging a certain resistance to that style of governance. Abbots of autonomous monasteries generally resisted giving any power to a central authority or to groups or committees outside their control. And so the office of Abbot General was becoming under sort of attack. At least it was the object of a certain degree of resentment. And this is one reason why it took so long, because often there's no agreement within the order. There exist within the order substantial differences of opinion, both about the nature and function of law and about the way in which the Cistercian charism is to be expressed. That different people have different ideas. The story was going around, I have no means of telling whether it is true or not. It was that some American abbot proposed that on major feasts like Christmas and Easter, that meat be permitted in the community. And to which a French abbot, or French abbots in general, I'm not sure which, replied, absolutely not. We all do it, but we're not going to change the law. In other words, there's a different idea from the law as an ideal in which you set forth the most beautiful expression and the maximal expression of the law as an ideal, to a more perhaps Anglo-Saxon approach to law, which is the law gives the minimum. This is the boundaries outside of which you may not wander. And so when you have two bodies with a different approach to law trying to draw up a law, you're going to find a little bit of friction. You're going to find a little bit of dissent. There exist within the order substantial differences of opinion, both about the nature and function of the law and the way in which the Cistercian charism is to be expressed. And throughout the process lurked the looming spectre of the Congregation for Religious, what they will approve and what they won't approve, how to keep them happy. And this was really the great obstacle to drawing up constitutions, is trying to keep everybody happy, trying to get a text that everybody would agree to. Because on the one hand, you had the monks and the nuns, although they don't matter much, of course. They're only the ones that keep the law. But ideally, the law would be something that would speak to them, that would harmonise with their aspirations, that would accord with what they would expect. The structure and form of the life would be what they came to the monastery to find. And then it had to keep superiors happy. And mostly this was by not infringing on the absolute right of superiors to do whatever they liked. They had to keep superiors happy. And for some of them who were more pastoral than others, it meant respecting their pastoral priorities, that the rule was meant to serve a pastoral function. It wasn't meant simply to blow the whistle and have everybody march in term. It was meant actually to be helpful, if that's not too revolutionary a concept, to be helpful in letting people achieve the goals and purposes for which they entered the monastic life. It was very obvious to me that some superiors are far more pastoral than others. And then you had to keep the different regions happy. As the idea of the regions emerged, with a great deal of resistance, I might add, as the idea of the regions emerged, then people in different regions began talking together and developing a consensus, and bringing that consensus to the chapter. We don't always know how other regions work, but some have a very intense process of debate among themselves, but when they go to face a chapter or something else, they always present a united front. So here you have a body of X votes that will go automatically en masse to a particular option. And if you have different regions voting as different blocks, then you're going to find conflict. So you have to keep the monks and nuns happy, you have to keep superiors happy, you have to keep the regions happy. And you have to keep the canonists happy. And especially where you get that combination of canonist and abbot, then they have sort of professional expectations of what our constitutions will contain. They want to sharpen things up and to have very polished concepts and tight categories. And finally, the Vatican Curia. And so you've got all these people, all these functions of trying to keep them all happy with a particular text. And that's the real challenge, is that anybody could send you off into a room and put you on bread and water for a couple of days and say, produce the text of the Constitution. You could do it, something which pleased you, but keeping all those bodies happy is something that is rather difficult. And especially when people have different modes of communication as well. Some will say outright what they want to be there, others operate in a more dialectical way, not to say a crooked sort of way at times. The most serious obstacle to definitive legislation was that the order was in a state of flux between 1965 and 1975. Everything was changing. Some houses were changing more radically than others. You get in a plane and pop over to the next house and they haven't changed at all. Some abbots were comfortable with change, some communities were comfortable with change. Some said, we'll hold on as long as possible. And so the order was in a state of disorder. And in some cases the changes were pretty radical, and it took a lot of effort on the part of particular abbots, admirable effort I might say, to bring them back into some sort of order. So just to look at some of these areas in which changes were there. Firstly, there were substantial changes in the legal status of lay brothers. That happened in 1965, although they had already begun to change. In 1958, at least an English office was offered to them, rather than just saying Hail Marys and Our Fathers. And also in their way of life. This meant that they started having a little bit more time for Lectio, perhaps less time for work, and this meant a redistribution of work responsibilities, which meant that the choir monks had to do more work than perhaps they were used to. And secondly, there was a strong debate on the role of eremitism in Cistercian life. And this led to an increasing number of initiatives. And it had some fairly prominent advocates, I might say. The third, since the special general chapters were to be prepared by broad consultation, community dialogues were introduced, sometimes with professional assistance, usually without. And often these community dialogues were a source of great upheaval in communities if they weren't managed. And the traditional Trappist silence was abandoned by the General Chapter of 1967. The same General Chapter gave approval for private rooms for sleeping. It also permitted their use for prayer and Lectio, provided the common scriptorium was maintained, which is a wonderful example of compromise, isn't it? 1967 chapter also effectively discontinued the chapter of faults. And with vernacular liturgies, greater structural flexibility was needed in the office. And the same chapter almost unanimously approved a change in the wording of the abbatial mandate from life to a tempus non definitum, to a non-defined term. And then in 1974, limited mandates came. The most visible change was the move away from uniform observance. So all these things, all these various changes happened at different rates in different regions and in different monasteries. So the idea of everybody coming together and talking about silence, it was a different object that they were talking about. That there was a move away from uniform observance. And at the level of community living, a great difference, the most visible difference, was in deportment. People were no longer walking around with hoods up and irons in their sleeves or under their scapula and so forth. They were walking as though they were human beings. And that was the reason why it took so long, is that the order was in a state of flux, and you don't change things when everything is moving, and it's not only moving in a single movement. You've got all these little whirlpools in different communities and different regions and so forth, and you're saying, how can we produce a text which meets the desires and the responsibilities of all the communities? And we'll go on with this in the next talk.
Answer me.